My mother-in-law set the table like she was expecting a food critic. Cloth napkins folded into little swans, the good china she only brought out for people she actually respected, and a centerpiece that probably cost more than my weekly grocery run. She did this every single Sunday. And every single Sunday, I sat at that table feeling like I had accidentally wandered into a dinner party I was never invited to. My husband Elliot squeezed my knee under the table when we first sat down. Not the affectionate kind of squeeze, the kind that meant behave. I had been behaving for 4 years. His brother Scott was already holding court at the far end of the table. Scott, who had made partner at his firm last spring. Scott, who had just gotten back from a conference in Zurich. Scott, whose wife Margot was a hospitalist at Northwestern, and somehow still had time to train for a half marathon and keep a perfectly moisturized complexion. Scott and Margot were the kind of couple that made other people feel like they were failing at a game no one told them they were playing. I was a content strategist at a mid-sized marketing agency. I had been at the same company for 6 years. I drove a 2019 Honda Civic with a crack in the passenger side mirror that I kept meaning to get fixed. I wore the same navy blazer to every family event because it was the one thing in my closet that felt like it could hold its own in that dining room. "So, Wren," my mother-in-law said, passing the roasted potatoes, "anything new with you?" She asked me this every week. Every week, I gave some version of the same answer. Work is good, staying busy, same old. She would nod with the practiced warmth of a woman who had already stopped listening by the time I opened my mouth. "Actually, Scott got a mention in the Tribune," she said. "Not to me, to the table, to the air, to God." "Did you all see it? I have it saved on my phone." Elliot smiled. He always smiled when his mother pivoted away from me. I think he thought it was gentler that way. I put a spoonful of potatoes on my plate and went quiet. That night driving home, Elliot said he thought the dinner went well. I looked out the window at the streetlights blurring past and didn't say anything. He took my silence as agreement. He had gotten good at that. I want to explain something, because I think it matters. I did not grow up with money. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Indiana with a single mom who worked dispatch for a trucking company and took night classes at the community college for 8 years before she finally got her associate's degree. She hung it on the wall next to a photo of me at my kindergarten graduation and cried a little. I remember thinking that diploma looked like the most important thing in the world. I learned early that quiet work was still work, that you didn't announce the climb, you just climbed. When I moved to Chicago at 22 with a journalism degree and about $1,400 in savings, I was not impressive. I was a girl with a duffel bag and a spreadsheet of job applications and a very specific ability to not panic out loud. I took a content coordinator job at the agency that paid $38,000 a year. I was grateful for it. I made it work. I clipped coupons for groceries and told myself it was temporary. It was also the year I started writing on the side, not for any grand reason. I had an idea for a story, one of those hyper-specific, embarrassingly personal ideas that comes from living through something, and I needed somewhere to put it. So I started a blog, a pseudonymous blog on a free platform mostly for myself, sometimes for the handful of readers who stumbled across it. By year 2, it had 17,000 monthly readers. I never told Elliot, not because I wanted to deceive him, because I had learned something very specific about sharing unfinished things with people who were raised to evaluate finished things. His family valued results, credentials, the kind of success that came with a title and a firm handshake. A blog was not that. An idea was not that. A slow, uncertain climb was not that. So I kept it quiet, and I kept building. The Sunday that changed everything started the same way all the others did. I woke up with that low-grade dread that I'd come to associate with the smell of Elliot's mother's roast chicken. He was in a good mood talking about Scott's new car the whole drive there, and I sat in the passenger seat thinking about a campaign pitch I'd been working on at the office and half listening. At dinner, Scott announced that Margot had been asked to join an advisory board at the hospital. My mother-in-law looked like she might weep from happiness. "That's incredible," I said, and I meant it. Margot smiled at me. She was actually one of the kinder people at that table. I think she felt the dynamic too. Then Scott looked at me in that way he had, not unkind exactly, just the look of someone assessing square footage, and said, "What's going on with you these days, Ren? Still doing the blog stuff?" The table went quiet in that particular way that means everyone heard and no one wants to show it. I had made the mistake, about 2 years earlier, of mentioning the blog once. Just once, at another Sunday dinner, when the conversation had turned to side projects. Scott had said, "Oh, that's cute," and my mother-in-law had asked if I was going to monetize it. Elliot had looked at the ceiling. I had changed the subject and never brought it up again. "I work in content strategy," I said, keeping my voice even. "That's my full-time career, actually." Scott nodded. Right, but what's the ceiling on something like that? At some point you'd want to move into something more, I don't know. Scalable. Elliot laughed a little. Not cruelly, just reflexively. It was the kind of laugh you do when you're trying to smooth something over by pretending it was a joke. I put my fork down very carefully. Scalable, I repeated. I just mean, Margot and I were talking about this the other day. Career capital, right? You want to be building towards something. Equity, ownership, not just punching a clock somewhere. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like he was passing me a gift. Ren's good at what she does, Elliot said, but he said it the way you'd say the weather's been nice lately. Just a thing to say. I looked at my plate. I looked at the cloth napkins, still perfect in their little triangles. I looked at the centerpiece, which was a mason jar full of eucalyptus that cost about $40 at the Whole Foods on Michigan Avenue. I knew because I'd almost bought it myself last week. I thought about the email I had gotten on Thursday. Then I picked my fork back up and I finished my dinner. I should tell you what I'd actually been doing. 3 years ago, the blog crossed 50,000 monthly readers. I monetized it quietly, a newsletter subscription, some affiliate partnerships, eventually a sponsored content deal with a home goods brand that paid better than I expected. I kept reinvesting. I took an online course in content monetization. I started a second newsletter on a different topic. I hired a part-time virtual assistant through Upwork. When the first newsletter hit 6,000 subscribers, I kept my day job. I kept my title. I kept my Honda Civic with the cracked mirror. I did not do this to be mysterious. I did it because I needed to know it was real before I let anyone else have an opinion about it. Every time I had let someone see an unfinished thing before it was ready, I had paid for it. My mother had taught me to finish a thing before you set it on the table. Last year, the combined revenue from the newsletters crossed $180,000. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the kind of number someone drops in a story like this for effect, but here's what $180,000 actually looked like in my real life. It looked like a maxed out Roth IRA every January. It looked like a high-yield savings account I opened under my own name with enough in it to cover 2 years of our mortgage payments if something went wrong. It looked like a modest investment account that I managed through a brokerage app on my phone, mostly index funds, some individual positions I'd researched carefully. It looked like me sitting across from my mother-in-law in the same blazer eating the same roasted potatoes, while Scott talked about equity and ownership. The email I had gotten on Thursday was from an acquisitions editor at a mid-sized publisher. She had found my newsletter. She liked the voice, the readership numbers, the engagement data. She wanted to talk about a book deal. I hadn't responded yet. The following Sunday, Scott had news. He delivered it mid-meal, the way people do when they've been holding something all week. His firm had been approached by a larger firm about a potential merger. Nothing final, but significant. If it went through, his equity stake would be worth somewhere in the range of, and he paused here, because he wanted us to sit with what was coming, somewhere in the range of $400,000. My mother-in-law made a sound that can only be described as maternal triumph. Elliot said, "Scott, that's incredible." Margot smiled and looked at her plate. I had the feeling she'd been hearing about this for days. Scott was gracious about it, in the way people are gracious when they're all so clearly delighted. He talked about what it meant for their plans, for Margot's timeline, for whether they'd finally pull the trigger on the house in Wilmette they'd been looking at. Then he looked at me again. I think he meant it as an olive branch. I think he thought he was including me. You know what, Ren? This is what I was talking about last week. Ownership. This is the kind of thing that doesn't happen when you're working for someone else. You've got to build something that compounds. You're right, I said. You really do. Something in the way I said it made Margot look up. I've actually been thinking about that, I said. I got an email last week from an editor about a book deal. Scott's expression did something complicated. A book deal. For the newsletter, I said. Well, based on it, they want to expand it into a full manuscript. The readership numbers were enough to get them interested. How many subscribers do you have? Elliot asked. He said it almost to himself, like a reflex. Like he genuinely didn't know, like he'd never thought to ask. He hadn't. I hadn't told him. About 43,000 across both lists, I said. The main newsletter is the larger one. My mother-in-law had stopped eating. You have 43,000 subscribers, Scott said. On the newsletters, yes. The blog gets more traffic, closer to 90,000 unique visitors a month, but that's a separate metric. Silence. Not the polite, transitional kind. The real kind, where people are recalibrating. Since when? Elliot said. His voice was careful in a way it only got when he was trying not to sound surprised. I started the blog about 5 years ago. Monetized it seriously about 3 years in. It took a while to figure out the model. What's the revenue? Scott asked. He couldn't help it. Revenue was his language. I looked at him across the table. I thought about all the Sundays, the roast chicken, that's cute. What's the ceiling on something like that? Last year it cleared 6 figures, I said, comfortably. I did not say the number. Some things you keep to yourself. Margot was the first one to speak. She set down her fork and looked at me, really looked at me, and said, Wren, that's genuinely impressive. Thank you, I said, and I meant it. My mother-in-law said after a moment, well, why didn't you ever tell us? And that was the question, wasn't it? That was the whole thing right there, sitting in the middle of the table between the swan-folded napkins and the eucalyptus centerpiece. Because the last time I mentioned it, I said, the response was, that's cute. I wasn't unkind about it. I just said it plainly. I've learned to wait until there's something real to show. The drive home was the quietest it had ever been. Elliot drove. I looked out the window. The city moved past us, lit up and indifferent, and I let it. He didn't say anything until we were stopped at a light on Fullerton, and then he said, I didn't know. I know. You should have told me. I turned to look at him. He was staring at the red light. I tried to tell you once, I said. You changed the subject. And then Scott said that's cute and you laughed, not mean laughed, just laughed, and I decided the idea needed more time in the dark before I let anyone see it. He was quiet for a moment. That was years ago, he said. Yes. I didn't know it turned into this. I know you didn't. The light changed. He drove. At home we sat in the kitchen and I made tea, which was a thing I did when I needed something to do with my hands. He sat at the counter and I told him everything. The blog, the newsletters, the revenue, the Roth IRA, the savings account, the email from the editor. I laid it all out on the counter like receipts. He listened. He didn't interrupt, which surprised me. Elliot had a habit of problem-solving in real time, of jumping ahead before you'd finished the sentence. But he sat there and he listened until I was done. When I finished, he said, You built all of that alone. Yes. While we were living our regular life, while all of it was happening. Yes. He looked at me for a long time. Not accusatory. Something else. Why didn't you trust me with it? I thought about how to answer that honestly. Not because I wanted to hurt him, because he deserved an honest answer, and I had been sitting with this for a long time. I didn't distrust you, I said. I distrusted the version of you that exists in that dining room. The one that laughs when your brother dismisses me. The one that squeezes my knee when he means, don't make this awkward for me. That version of you would have had an opinion about the blog before it was ready for opinions. And the opinion would have been filtered through everything your family thinks success is supposed to look like. He didn't argue with me. That was how I knew I'd said the true thing. I want to know you, he said after a while. The whole version of you, not just the one that shows up for Sunday dinner. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in a long time. Maybe ever. I slid a mug of tea across the counter to him. Then stop laughing, I said. When they dismiss me, just stop. That's where it starts. He wrapped his hands around the mug. He nodded, slowly, like he was understanding something that was going to take time to fully understand. I emailed the editor back on Monday morning. I did it from my desk at the agency, between a 9 o'clock stand-up and a client call, in about 4 minutes. I told her I was interested. I asked about timeline and expectations. I kept it professional. Then I closed the laptop and went to my meeting. I didn't tell my mother-in-law about the book deal until it was signed. Some things need more time in the dark before you let them breathe. I had learned that. She called me when Elliot told her. I was driving, so I pulled over in a parking lot to take the call. I didn't realize, she said. Her voice was different than usual. Smaller somehow. I didn't understand what you were building. I know, I said. I think I made assumptions. I think a lot of people did. There was a pause. Then she said, Would you want to have lunch sometime? Just the two of us? I looked out through the windshield at the strip mall parking lot. A woman was loading groceries into a minivan 2 spots over. Normal afternoon, normal Tuesday. Sure, I said, I'd like that, and I meant it. Not completely, not without reservations, but enough. Some people hear a story like this, and they want it to be a revenge story. They want the moment of revelation to be a weapon. They want the in-laws humbled, the husband groveling, the woman triumphant and untouchable at the head of the table. That's not what it was. It was more like a door opening, the kind that had been stuck for years. That took more force to open than I expected, and that let in both the light and the cold air at once. I still go to Sunday dinners. We still sit at that table with the cloth napkins. Scott still talks about his deals. My mother-in-law still sets the centerpiece with the same careful precision, but something is different. She asks me about the book sometimes. Real questions with follow-ups. She listened last month when I told her about the editorial process, and she didn't change the subject. Elliot still squeezes my knee under the table. But it's not the behave squeeze anymore. It's something else. Something that means I see you. It took a long time. 4 years of Sunday dinners and quiet building and keeping things in the dark until they were ready. That's not a strategy I'd recommend to everyone, but it was mine, and it worked. My mother hung her associate's degree next to my kindergarten photo and called it her greatest accomplishment. I think what she was really saying was, quiet work is still work. Slow climbs still get you somewhere. I have her photo on my desk now, next to the monitor where I write. I look at it when I need to remember why I never stopped. I used to think silence was something that happened to you, that you went quiet because someone took the words away. But looking back at those 4 years of Sunday dinners, I don't think that's what was happening. I chose the silence, not out of weakness, out of something closer to self-preservation and, honestly, a kind of discipline I didn't even have a name for at the time. Here's what I've come to understand about cause and effect, the real kind, not the tidy version people put on greeting cards. Every action compounds. The dismissal compounds. The laughter that follows it compounds. But so does the quiet work, so does the decision to protect an idea until it's strong enough to survive other people's opinions. Every morning I sat down and wrote. Every subscriber who found my newsletter. Every dollar I saved instead of spent trying to look like something I wasn't. All of it was accumulating in the background while the table talked about Scott's deals and Margot's advisory board. What I did wasn't patient in the peaceful sense. It was patient the way you're patient when you're waiting for something you decided you actually believe in. That's a different thing entirely. Passive patience is just waiting. What I had was more like controlled motion. Constant. Quiet. And visible to everyone at that dining room table. The part that took me longest to untangle was the piece about Elliot. Because I did love him. I do love him. And still, I kept something enormous from him for years. I've had to sit with the ethics of that, really sit with it, because it would be easy to frame the whole story as a triumph and skip past the harder question. The honest answer is that I made a decision to protect the thing I was building from an environment that had shown me, repeatedly, it would not be received fairly. That was a real calculation. It was also a wall I built inside my marriage, and walls don't just come down because you finally open the door. What I know now is that integrity isn't about being an open book at all times. It's about being honest, when honesty can do something useful. The timing matters, but so does the follow-through. The conversation Elliot and I had in that kitchen, the real one, with all the receipts on the counter, that was the integrity. The 4 years before it were the preparation. The thing about building anything quietly, whether it's a business or a sense of self, is that it requires you to trust your own judgment before anyone else validates it. That's not easy in a world that tells you credibility comes from other people's recognition. My mother understood this without ever framing it in those words. She just worked. She kept going. She finished things before she put them on the table. I'm not the same person who sat at that dinner table in the same navy blazer 4 years ago. I'm not harder exactly. I'm just clearer about what I'm building, about who gets to see it and when, and about the kind of table I actually want to sit at for the rest of my life. Wren figured it out late, maybe. But she figured it out.